The treatment of criminals was considerably better than that of counter-revolutionaries, and for the most part only criminals were given time off their sentences for satisfactory work, which was a great incentive to their working well. *3. Petrov is more specific. In those days in the Kolyma, there was also a very high credit for working days, a shortening of the sentence for those who worked. Men sentenced for criminal acts received credit for 150 days per year, and sometimes for 200. Those sentenced for counter-revolution only on 58-10 agitation received 50 days credit per year. Only the remaining others, who had been sentenced on the more serious articles of the code, received no credit at all. 23. Even so, the better physical treatment went with, and implied, a fairly humane psychological relationship with the prisoners. And this in turn meant that the criminal element was not at this time used by the administration as an instrument for terrorizing the politicals, but was held in reasonable check. It is also true that in this earlier period, the prisoners had not experienced conditions, in jail and in transit, as crowded, as ill-fed, and as unhealthy as became normal under Yezhov. And these earlier prisoners had a much lower proportion of intellectuals, and a higher one of peasants, not only stronger and more adjusted to, and experienced in outdoor physical labor, but also less amenable to bullying by urkas. In retrospect then, the period was idyllic. The frightful casualties of the first years were almost forgotten. The fact that the political prisoners should not have been there at all, being innocent of anything except a critical attitude to Stalin, and more often not even that, was not the fault of the local authorities. And elsewhere in Russia things were already far worse, but the end of the Berzin era was approaching. At the June 1937 plenum of the Central Committee, Stalin personally attacked the practice, which he said had come into force, of coddling prisoners. Throughout the USSR, the response was a vast increase in brutality. A decision to extend this to Kolyma came shortly. NKVD chief Yezhov, certainly with Stalin's approval, specifically denounced conditions in the area with indignation at a meeting of the Central Committee, evidently the one held on 11th to 12th October 1937. The fall of Berzin and his associates naturally followed. Berzin had been put up as a candidate in the election then being held for the Supreme Soviet, but a week before the voting prisoners noted that his portraits disappeared and his name was withdrawn. There seems to have been some apprehension that on the basis of his powerful and quasi-independent fief, Berzin might offer resistance. An NKVD delegation arrived with promises of awards and promotion, feted him in Magadan, and only arrested him on the airfield, of which their members had by then taken control. He was taken to Moscow, to be shot, apparently as a Japanese spy, on 1st November 1939 *. His wife was also jailed, as was then customary. The last ship of the season as it happened, the Nikolai Yezhov, meanwhile brought in hundreds of replacements for the lesser posts held by the Berzin gang. His close collaborators underwent the same fate. His deputy Filipov died, or committed suicide in Magadan prison. Alexei Yezerov, called Red Lyopka, head of the southern administration, Tsyrko, head of the northern administration, Mazrij Zvoskov. But the Berzin affair also involved, as Shalamov tells us, the arrest and execution of several thousand people and the infliction of severe penalties on several thousand others, prisoners or otherwise. Commandants of mines, of camps, of sectors, instructors, secretaries of party committees, heads of gangs, senior prisoners, brigade leaders. /28 At first, this wave of arrests, though causing apprehension, did not appear to the ordinary prisoners to signify any basic change. In the northern administration, a prisoner noted the arrest of its chief engineer, Glyn, of the heads and chief engineers of a number of mines and of many other free employees, and the renaming of the Berzin mine as *Uruk. He and his mates were aware of endless secret conferences of party members with the new head of the region's political section. They saw barbed wire being set up everywhere, searchlights, machine gun posts. More definite rumors began to percolate. A friend, who worked in the planning section, told me that Moscow revoked the earlier plan for gold production, and sent in a new, and much higher one. Our administration was to receive an additional 30,000 prisoners. And then, late at night, while Kudyakov, Stepanov and I were asleep in our room near the carpentry shop, someone knocked violently on the door. I opened it. Sukhanov entered, looking very upset. "What has happened?" I asked. "Be prepared for very unpleasant things. There has just been a meeting of the leading personnel of the administration. We were informed of new instructions from Pavlov, the chief of Destroy. We are ordered to remove him immediately from administrative posts, all prisoners sentenced for counter-revolution, and send them to general work at the mines. All the other prisoners can remain temporarily only at the most common, non-responsible work." 23. This was the first blow in the mass terror against the prisoners which now ensued. The year that followed was the most frightful the camps had known. Previous years had seen, on occasion, massive casualties, but these had been due to inefficiencies in supply, attempts to carry out assignments in impossible conditions, and in fact, if in exaggerated form, the normal incompetence and brutality of Soviet life. When the difficulties could be overcome, conditions, as we have seen, were tolerable. But above all, prisoners were not subjected to lethal conditions on purpose. Now came a regime under which the prisoners' chances of survival, even if they escaped the wave of executions which ensued, were reduced to a minimum. Not only was the ration system made so inadequate that survival, except by the holders of functions, such as clerk or nurse, became impossible over any long period, but even such disgusting harassments took place as the banning of adequate clothing. Under newly enforced regulations, fur clothing was banned, and replaced by wadding jackets and trousers which soon hung like torn rags upon the bodies of the gaunt prisoners. 13 felt boots were similarly replaced by canvas shoes. The result, the only result, was as was clearly intended, a great increase in suffering and in death. This single point illustrates more clearly than anything else the animus of the new authorities. Everywhere those in charge of the camps were given higher and higher production targets. At the same time, their human raw material became increasingly weaker and less effective. Those who arrived from the mainland, mostly townsmen, had experienced the intensely debilitating effects of the Azov prison regime, and of the cattle trucks and rations and of Vladivostok transit camp. In Kolyma they were driven directly to hard physical labor, for which they were quite unfitted. The newly introduced ration scales were barely sufficient even for those who fulfilled their full norms, and impossible for others. As output dropped, the local NKVD commandants had no option but to increase working hours so that a vicious circle was established. The only way the system could be kept going at all was that as the gunners died out, they were replaced by a continual stream of new prisoners. One estimate is that henceforward every kilogram of gold cost one human life. Chapter 31938 Baptism of Horror. And so Kolyma entered its long period as the worst and deadliest of all the labor camp areas. There were good years and bad years in the epoch which followed. None was to be quite as bad as 1938 itself, but none was to be more than a comparative relief. Meanwhile, as the winter of 1937-8 set in, the tempest, as prisoners described it, began to rage more and more violently. The first major policy decision was to insist on winter work in the mines, though, as Petrov points out, this was highly uneconomic, especially as regards labor. The prisoners did find that work in the mine held one vast advantage: it was relatively warm. There was no snow, no icy piercing wind. The steam which thawed out the sand also lent some warmth to the air. The water in the draining ditches froze only at the very exit of the mine. But there were also disadvantages. The boots were always wet, never quite drying out. Rheumatism was guaranteed. Then, the air in the pit, where there was no ventilation whatsoever, was filled twice daily with the poisonous fumes of blasted ammonal. Only 30 minutes were allowed for the clearing of the fumes through the entrance of the mine, after which the workers were driven back into the pits to continue their work. Many of them succumbed to the poisoned atmosphere and coughed violently, spitting blood and often particles of lung. After a short time, these were usually sent either to the weak squads for lumbering, or to their graves. Mortality was especially high among the men who carted the wet sand from the barrack after the washing. From the steamy, damp atmosphere of the heater, the perspiring wheelbarrow pushers slipped through the opening, which was covered by an old blanket, rolling out their wheelbarrows into the piercing 50 below zero frost. The time limit in this work was, at the most, 1 month, after which either pneumonia or meningitis dispatched the worker into the next world. 23. The new prisoners, moreover, were mainly people who had never done any physical work. Scientists, artists, politicians, educators, leaders of industry, trade, and government. 13. A veteran prisoner describes them. Their faces all showed signs of frostbite, although the winter was only 3 months old, and the most severe frosts were yet to come. The majority of them were so dirty looking I was willing to wager that some of them had not washed their faces for weeks. Their clothes were like nothing I had ever seen at the Kolyma. Everything, from the torn boots to the incredibly dirty rags wrapped around their necks instead of scarves, their burned and tattered winter coats. The men had starved, worn-out faces, quiet voices, were completely absorbed in themselves, and uncommunicative. Their range of interest was limited to work and food, and more food, and food again. Besides work and food, the other questions discussed among them were tobacco, the eternal Kolyma shag, and the cold. They came to the tent after having supper in the dining room. They had rushed there as soon as they had returned to the camp from work, and immediately crowded around the stoves, coming so close that one feared they would catch fire. Indeed, now and again one heard voices. "Look out, your coat's burning." The repulsive smell of burning rags would come up and bite into your nostrils. The sight of these creatures, who had almost lost the image of man, made me feel distinctly uncomfortable. The possibility of becoming one of them seemed anything but attractive. 23. Conditions killed them off quickly. But conditions were assisted by a massive employment of execution, as a reprisal against failure to produce adequate gold, and in effect, on any pretext whatever. The visible villain was Major, later Colonel Gronin, the new head of Hospital. His rule gave his name to a whole epoch of terror, the Gronin's China carat, as with the Azov's China, which was sweeping the USSR as a whole. Wholesale arrests began in the camp. As a rule, the charge was systematic under fulfillment of quotas. Since no man in the gold field could possibly fulfill them, the failure was ascribed as criminal when the worker completed less than 50% of the quota. It was absolutely impossible to measure accurately the exact performance of a worker, and the estimate made depended entirely upon the attitude of the foreman. The foreman made daily measurements, in a rough and ready fashion, with the help of a tape line, and made their reports to the office, where the volume of excavated sand was translated into percentages of the daily quota fulfilled by each brigade. In doing this, a practice was systematically resorted to whereby a certain amount of work performed by the less efficient brigades was stolen from them and credited to the better brigades as a means of encouraging them. But the foremen were not altogether free in recording their measurements. Once a month, a measurement of the mine's entire output was made by surveyors with instruments of great accuracy. The engineers measured the depth the mine increased during the month, and compared this with the added up measurements of the foreman. When the figures disagreed, and they always did, and to a great extent the foremen were merely reprimanded. Now, by Pavlov's new order, foremen guilty of excessive measurements were to be put on trial. The same order stated the fact that 6 foremen had been executed for deceiving the state. It was natural that the foreman often went to the other extreme. Charity begins at home, and deliberately gave lower figures. The official figures for labor productivity immediately dropped heavily. Then the firing squad set to work. A representative of the NKVD, 3-man court, the Troika, appeared at the goldfield. He held conferences with the section heads and demanded lists from them of malicious saboteurs who systematically failed to make their quotas. The section heads had no alternative but to prepare such lists and to include in them the least able workers, who lowered the average labor productivity for that section. 23. Another veteran convict recalls. In our mine, the 3rd section was particularly active during the 1937-8 period. Some nights when we came back from work, the guards read out 30 to 50 names. The persons called had to step out of the ranks and were marched off immediately to the prison. The next morning, they were driven in trucks to the Cotton Exopka, where they were shot. In the evening, in addition to the list of new victims, the guards would read us the announcement. By judgment of the camp command, then would follow the names of those who had been executed, shot for sabotage, ill will and agitation against the Soviet power. 10R, as Solzhenitsyn categorizes the crimes, the announcement of which was followed by the pinning of the lists to the camp notice boards. For counter-revolutionary agitation, for insulting the guard, for failure to fulfill the work norm. Shalamov well develops what these offenses amounted to. For counter-revolutionary agitation *, this was the way one of the paragraphs in Gronin's sentences began. For the man in the street, in 1937, it hardly needed explaining what counter-revolutionary agitation was, praising a Russian novel, published abroad 10 years, declaring that one queued too long to buy soap, 5 years, but in the camps there was none of this gradation. 5, 10, 20 years. Say aloud that the work was harsh, mutter the most innocent remark about Stalin, keep silent while the crowd of prisoners yelled long life Stalin, and your shot silence is agitation. No trial, no investigation. The proceedings of the Troika, that famous institution, always meant death. They shot also for outrage against a member of the guard. Any insult, any insufficiently respectful reply, any discussion, when hit or beaten up, any too disrespectful a gesture by a prisoner towards a guard, was called an attempt at violence against the guard. They shot for refusal to work. Thousands of prisoners died before understanding the mortal danger of their attitude. Old men at the end of their strength, exhausted and famished skeletons, incapable of walking a step to reach the camp gate in the morning when the columns, wound towards the mine, stayed on their mattresses. They wrote their refusal on forms, renewed in advance. Although shot and clothed in conformity with the exigencies of the season, the richer minds ran to properly printed forms, where it was enough to write the name, and a few points, date of birth, article of the law, duration of sentence. 3 refusals meant the execution platoon according to the law. Even at the end of one's strength, one had to go to the mine. The gang chief signed every morning for this unit of production, and the administration countersigned. This done, the prisoner was saved. For this day he escaped death. Once out he could not work, since he was incapable of it. He had to endure his day of torture to the end, but he was not classed as refractory. The administration could not then shoot the sick man. It hadn't, they said, the right. I will not judge the extent of these rights, but for long years I struggled against myself to not refuse to go to the mine, and to drag myself to the gates of the zone. The last heading, the richest, under which they shot prisoners by waves, was non-fulfillment of norms. This crime took entire brigades to the common graves. The authorities provided a theoretical basis for this rigor. All over the country the 5-year plan was broken down into precise figures, in each factory for each establishment. At Kolyma they were broken down for each gang. The 5-year plan is the law, not to carry out the plan is a crime. 28 And so, in a camp, for more than a month, day and night, at each morning and evening roll call, an officer would read out the flowing lists of the condemned to death. At 50C, musicians chosen from the common criminals would sound a fanfare before and after the reading of each document. Each list invariably ended with the words, "The judgment has been executed." Chief of Hospital, Colonel Gronin. 28 According to various accounts, accepted by Roy Medvedev and others, Gronin himself used to walk down the line of prisoners, on parade, shooting them when he felt like it. 2 soldiers followed him, taking turns at loading his revolver. Perhaps on occasion. But according at least to Shalamov, who saw him some 15 times on his visits to camps of the Northern Administration, this particular story is a legend. As chairman of the liquidation troika he was content to sign the decrees. If Gronin personally did not shoot prisoners, at least in public, the story nevertheless seems to have a foundation in fact, as with lesser officials such as Nikolai Aglamov, head of the Southern Camp Administration, who liked to select a brigade which was guilty of something from those paraded before him. He would order it to be led to one side, and himself shot the terrified people with his pistol as they huddled together, accompanying the operation with merry cries. The bodies were not buried. When May came they decomposed, and then prisoners who had survived were summoned to bury them in return for increased rations, and even alcohol. 32. This attitude to human life became common among the NKVD 21 as a whole. A typical account is of a drunken NKVD officer appearing at a worksite accusing prisoners of stealing drinking bowls from the state. It was then quite common for them to carry their gruel to the worksite to eat it and shooting wildly at the group, killing one and wounding two others. 23. In the women's camps, 2 random killing was the norm. That year, 1st May and 7th November were celebrated by sending batches of prisoners, without other pretext, to the penalty cells, where many died. Then on the usual parades, the order would be given for every 10th woman to be taken out and shot. 22. On one occasion 30 Polish women were shot in a batch at the Elgin camp. 32. Meanwhile, starvation and epidemics took their toll, as in the men's camps. Many camps became famous for their executions and mass graves. Oratukan, Polyarny Springs, Vistoplius, Anushka, and even the agricultural camp Dukcha. 32. The Zolotisty mine had a particularly murderous reputation. Their Solzhenitsyn tells us brigades were taken from the face during the day and shot one after the other on the spot. This was not instead of executions. At night those went on as usual. 32. On his formal rounds, Gronin took special note of those who were convicted of KRTD, counter-revolutionary Trotskyist activity. Which of these have not met their quota? He would ask. Most had not, could not. At evening roll call, when they returned from the mines, he would call out these unfortunates, revile them as saboteurs, who were trying to continue their criminal counter-revolutionary Trotskyist activities, even in camp, and he would have them driven in a herd out of the gate. At a short distance from the camp they would be shot en masse, under his personal supervision. This was still not enough. At night he would have thousands of enemies of the people taken out of all the Kolyma camps, loaded onto trucks, and driven off to a prison. This prison, called Serpentinka, is about 375 miles west of Magadan, in the midst of the forest, and it is probably one of the most ghastly institutions in the Soviet Union. 13. The Serpentinka or Serpentinaya death camp was indeed the scene of mass executions, continually through 1938, as the liquidation center of the Northern Administration. It had been carefully prepared. One prisoner recalls that on a long journey, on the way up, a little off from the road, we passed a few long and unpleasant-looking barracks. At one time those barracks had housed a road-building unit, and were called Serpentinaya, but since the completion of the road to Kotonik they had been empty for over a year. I recalled that a few days before, by orders from Magadan, Serpentinaya had been transferred to the district section of the NKVD, which sent 2 brigades of men there to carry out some secret work. The little camp was to be fenced, with 3 rows of barbed wire. Watchtowers for sentries were to be erected every 25 yards, and a commodious house for officials and guards would be built, as well as a garage. What puzzled me was the garage. It was not usual to build a garage in a small camp like this, especially since only 3 miles away were the big garages, in the Kotonik camp, and in the Vodopianov gold mines. Later I learned it was used to house 2 tractors, the engines of which produced enough noise to deaden the sounds of shooting and cries of the men. However, after a short stay, the tractors were moved to some gold field, and the automobile drivers, who passed the camp at night, sometimes heard the proceedings there with the utmost clarity. 23. Another account tells us that, at Serpentinka each day, 30 to 50 people were shot in a shed near the cooler. The corpses were then dragged behind a mound, on motorized sledges. There was also another method. Prisoners were led with eyes bound to a deep trench, and were shot in the ear, or the back of the neck. 32. Serpentinka victims sometimes waited several days to be shot, standing in a shed packed so tight that when they were given a drink, in the form of pieces of ice being thrown into them, they could not move their hands for it, and had to try to catch it in their mouths. 32. Another prisoner describes a particular case of an acquaintance. Skeletons, they worked badly. Yukov, the brigade leader, asked for better rations. The director refused. The famished gang tried heroically to fulfill the norms, and faded away. Everyone turned against Yukov. Yukov made more and more vigorous complaints and protests. His gang's output went on falling, and so its rations went down. Yukov tried to intercede with the administration. This in turn asked the competent services to inscribe Yukov and his men on the lists. They shot Dukov and all his gang one morning by the Serpentinka. 28. Only a few fortunate prisoners, who were sentenced merely to a 10-year addition to their term, came back from Serpentinka to the camps. Years later, they were so gripped by the horror of it that they did not dare to tell their fellow prisoners of the inhumanity they had seen and experienced. When they at last brought themselves to speak of it, they looked anxiously around to make sure that no informer was nearby. 13. When in the natural course of events, Gronin was himself executed the following year, apparently like Berzin, as a Japanese spy, his Serpentinka subordinates down to rank and file executioners, drivers and grave diggers were shot too, and the camp was razed. His victims, however, were not rehabilitated, and none of his sentences was quashed. Later gold was found on the site and had to be dug up through a veritable stratum of bones. Serpentinka-type operations are estimated to have seen about 26,000 executions in 1938. The remainder of the 40,000 or more, who according to Roy Medvedev, were shot over the whole region during that year, perished near their own camps or at other regional centers. Many more, probably between 5 and 10 times as many, simply died of hunger, cold and overwork. Since the summer of 1938, that summer of unhallowed memory, there were 3 degrees of punishment in the camps of the Northern Administration. The highest was shooting. The second, almost equivalent, was exile to the Shturmovy mine, to the separate camp at Panning Unit No. 8. The third and mildest, imprisonment in the local punishment cell, at the camp where the culprit lived. It was rumored about the 8th unit at Shturmovy that no one could survive the regime there for more than a month, and that even more people passed through this camp than through the butcher shop at Serpentinaya. 23. A lorry driver tells that at Shturmovy, the tents were full of gaping holes, through which blew the cold winter air. The broken iron stoves were not lit. The filth was unbelievable. The beds had neither mattresses, blankets, nor pillows. Only here and there dirty rags lay strewn about. Seeing that there was nothing to choose from, since all tents were the same, I went into one of them, and began to pace from corner to warm myself a little. I paced for a long time. It had been long dark when the men returned from work. They brought some firewood, and the stoves belched forth smoke from all their holes, creating an illusion of warmth. The tents were lighted only by the fire. In the stove there were no lamps, only the yard was lit by the dazzling searchlights, set up in the watchtowers. I had seen a great variety of men, during my stay at Tumani, among them many like those who sat around the stove, in the smoke-filled tent, but I had never seen such a complete collection of typical Dakodigas left bracket goners right bracket. 23. But even in the ordinary camps, even in the early weeks of the brief Kolyma summer, the men revealed a tendency to die at a rate never before known in the region. Frequently this happened all of a sudden, sometimes even while the man was at work. A man pushing a wheelbarrow up the high runway to the panning apparatus would suddenly halt, sway for a moment, and fall down from a height of 24 to 30 feet. And that was the end. Or a man loading a barrow, prodded by the shouts of a foreman or a guard, unexpectedly would sink to the ground, blood would gush from his mouth, and everything was over. The death rate was particularly high among men brought to the Kolyma during the last 6 months. Their body resistance had been undermined in jail before they were shipped to the gold fields, and they simply succumbed under the violent pace of work. 23. Shalamov describes how in his camp similarly, in the whole of 1937 on Karat Y, 2 men out of 2 or 3,000, 1 prisoner and 1 free man, had died in the partisan mine. They buried them side by side, under a hill. 2 rough monuments, a rather smaller one, for the prisoner, marked their 2 tombs. But in 1938 an entire brigade worked permanently digging graves. The rock and the eternally frozen earth of the permafrost refused the corpses. The rock had to be dynamited, broken open, prized apart. Digging graves involved the same procedure, the same instruments, the same material and the same workers, as digging for gold. The whole brigade filled its days making these graves, or rather, ditches into which the anonymous corpses were fraternally piled, not totally anonymous perhaps, since following instructions the sub-boss representing the administration attached a tag carrying the number of his personal case to the left leg of the naked corpse before burial. The doctors did not dare, in their reports, to give the real cause of death. There burgeoned polyvitaminosis, pellagra, APE. The enigmatic EP was extreme physiological debilitation, a diagnosis which represented a step towards the truth. But only the boldest doctors, not themselves prisoners, gave such diagnoses. The formula alimentary dystrophy slipped later into the reports of the Kolyma doctors, after the blockade of Leningrad, during the war, when it became possible to name, even though only in Latin, the true cause of death. 28. Not long after, a new category of imprisonment was introduced, katorga. The word, referring to the old tsarist system of forced labor, was in fact far worse. The katorzniki worked in special camps, in chains, and without blankets or mattresses at nights. None survived. The Tempest of 1938 was the worst time of all in Kolyma. Though things improved a little the following year, the principles established in 1938 remained in force. The appalling ration scales, the ban on warm clothes and shoes, a death rate lower than that of 1938 but still murderously high, marked the whole period. As in the rest of the country, 1938 represented a violent breaking with old standards. It was followed by, and it constituted the foundation stone, of a less ravaging, but in a sense, an even more dehumanizing consolidation and systematization of permanent terror. There was a marked lessening in indiscriminate shooting. But that sanction remained, and was enforced frequently enough when it was thought suitable. The basic attitude of the authorities to the prisoner's life, that it was in effect already forfeit, remained firm. In the winter of 1938, 9 Karat, a prisoner tells us, things became somewhat calmer. There were scarcely any shootings now, but the mortality rate did not diminish, since the physical resistance of the prisoners, undermined by the difficult spring and summer, now disappeared entirely under the hard winter conditions. It must also be added that the diet of the workers deteriorated dreadfully with the end of the large-scale washing. There is no gold, so they give us no food, I was told by an acquaintance, an employee of the local supply section. 23. One of the new orders was that work, which had hitherto stopped when the temperature went down to 50, would go on until it was 60. However, no thermometer was visible to the prisoners, and instructions were simply phoned down by the administration. Only 3 working days were cancelled for reasons of low temperature in the winter of 1938-9, as against 15 the previous winter, but even then the woodcutting workers had to go out. The continuity of the official attitude to the prisoners can best be documented at this point by a brief selection of incidents and developments spanning the whole period. Mrs. Ginsburg recalls the fate of a friend in the winter of 1939, for one of us found a fairly recent number of Pravda, and when we read it after lights out, its contents caused a sensation, for it gave the full text of Hitler's latest speech, followed by a respectful commentary, and a 2-page photograph of Molotov receiving von Ribbentrop *K, charming family group, remarked Katia Rotmistrovskaya, as she climbed onto her upper bunk. She was rash. I had warned her repeatedly that there were people among us who listened carefully to what was said at night. In the end, Katya's lack of prudence cost her her life. 6 months later, she was shot for anti-Soviet propaganda in the huts. 4. 1940, a Pole tells us the orchestra very often played while the prisoners were at work. To the accompaniment of this music, the guards would fall out prisoners, whose work was especially feeble, and shoot them, there and then. The shots rang out one after another. The bodies of the murdered men were also buried under the brushwood, on the surface of the mines. A Jew from Lwów, working alongside me, was so exhausted that he repeatedly fainted at work. The guard ordered him to fall out, took him to a nearby shed, and there he was shot. I heard the shot and saw his body a few minutes later. 2. In the summer of 1940, Shalamov tells us of the local mobile detachment, designed to catch escapers. It was commanded by the young Corporal Postnikov. Drunk with murder, he fulfilled his task with zeal and passion. He had personally captured 5 men. As always in such cases, he had been decorated and received a premium. The reward was the same for the dead and the living. It was not necessary to deliver the prisoners complete. One August morning, a man who was going to drink at a stream fell into an ambush set by Postnikov and his soldiers. Postnikov shot him down with a revolver. They decided not to drag the body to the camp, but to leave it in the taiga. The signs of bears and wolves were numerous. For identification, Postnikov cut off the fugitive's hands with an axe. He put the hands in his knapsack and went to make his report on the hunt. The report went out the same day. One soldier carried the packet. Postnikov gave leave to die others, in honor of the occasion. In the night the corpse got up. Pressing his bleeding wrists against his chest, he left the taiga following the trail, and reached the prisoner's tent. With pale face, mad blue eyes, he looked inside, holding himself at the opening, leaning against the doorposts, and muttering something. Fever devoured him. His padded coat, his trousers, his rubber boots, were stained with black blood. They gave him warm soup, wrapped his chopped off wrists in rags and took him to the infirmary. But already Postnikov and his men came running out of their little hut. The soldiers took the prisoner. He was not heard of again. 28 Miss Ustensberg recounts, in the same year, a refrain: "We shall meet again." We stood about for some time, by the camp gates, while our guards argued with Kukurenko, a big copper-faced man, in charge of the infirmary, and politely called doctor, but in fact only a medical orderly. We heard him say, "What if some of them die on the way? They wire politicals. You can see how they are dressed." As usual, our clothes were the worst of any. For in 1940, or early 1941, a free sailor at Nagevo saw the following incident. Boxes of tinned and bottled food were being unloaded from a steamer. One fell and broke open. A bottle of preserved fruit was smashed. The stevedore bent down, picked up a piece of pear, or some other fruit, and put it in his mouth. The NKVD man, on guard, went up to him without a word, and with a shot from his revolver, laid him out on the spot. That is the rule, the sailor comments, for theft while loading murder on the spot, even if the theft is of the kind described in this case. Nevertheless, there is a great deal of stealing. Life in any case is worth nothing. 33 in 1941. On the outbreak of war, prisoners sentenced under Article 58 were sent from Magadan to camps in the interior. The official tenor working day was raised to 12, and less officially was often 16. And no holidays of any sort permitted. The bread ration was fatally reduced from a kilo to half a kilo. Non-fulfillment of norms was treated as ruthlessly as in 1938 as sabotage, involving the death penalty. Sentences signed at the time by Colonel Drabkin were hung in the eating rooms. All accounts of this period show it to have been particularly lethal. But when the war ended and more normal conditions were restored, the basic attitude remained. In 1949, a camp doctor called Major Vostokov told one prisoner, "Before being a doctor, I am a Chekist. Why, and as such I must tell you that you are not brought here to live but to suffer and die. If you live, it means that you are guilty of one of two things. Either you worked less than was assigned you, or you ate more than your proper due." 31 in 1950, after the first communist defeats in Korea, a new wave of terror swept Kolyma. Officials, or some of them, seemed genuinely to fear a general war and the arrival of the Americans. One prisoner reports being harangued to the effect that if the Allies did indeed land, we shall blow up the mine entrances, and you will die like rats 200 yards below without seeing a single American or British uniform. 31 orders came to carry out mass shootings for the slightest slowdown. Camp commandants had a free hand. Some shot prisoners at random, simply to spread terror. Prisoners who after 14 hours in the mines could not do further work were shot and their bodies left on the ground for a day as a warning. Food became worse and scarcer, the output went down, and execution for sabotage became common. And we are told, for example, that at Dubin, in 1951, 3 prisoners of a group which had been allowed out to gather berries got lost. When they were found, their heads were bashed in with rifle butts, and the camp chief, Senior Lieutenant Lomaga, had their bodies hauled past the assembled inmates in that condition. 32 When this particular wave of terror passed, normal terror was resumed. And the continuing attitude reported by Miss Ustensberg in 1939 was still expressed openly. More than once, one of the officers told us contemptuously, "If you think that we are so anxious to get more metal that we will do all in our power to keep you alive, you're mistaken. We don't give a damn for your output or your lives. All we want is to punish you for your crimes." 31 Even accounts of Kolyma in 1953 show no real improvement in conditions. But the prisoners' morale naturally rose with Stalin's death and the fall of Beria, while the administration was shaken and became a trifle uncertain for the same reasons. The immediate post-Stalin amnesty only affected prisoners doing less than 5 years, so applied almost entirely to common criminals. In one camp, only 2 out of 250 prisoners benefited by the amnesty. Symbolic changes in the camp included a cancellation of the rule requiring prisoners to wear numbers on their clothing, and from then on they were called by their names. In one camp, the commandant, a Colonel Vasiliev, commonly known as the Rat, who a month previously would have beaten a prisoner to death as a matter of routine if he had caught him without a number, delivered a strange harangue to his charges, lasting more than an hour, beginning with the revolt of Spartacus and ending by threatening severe punishment to anyone caught wearing a number. He concluded, "Woe to those who misunderstand our deeds and mistake our humanitarian feelings for weakness. They will be summarily wiped out." 31. It was only in 1955-6 that we can really speak of the system coming to an end, or at least becoming far smaller, less arbitrary, and with a much lower death rate. The days when Kolyma was one end of the spectrum typifying Stalinism, with the Lubyanka at the other, had ended, and only the labor camp system, as it persists today, remained. When we deal, in the chapters that follow, with every aspect of Kolyma, we shall see that the accounts vary little, even as concerns quite minor detail, whether they are dated from 1939 or 1943, or 1948 or 1952. We have in this chapter dealt briefly with the frightful actions and the inhumane habits of mind on which from 1938 the Kolyma system proper was built, and sketched the persistence of that tradition. As we said, there were to be ups and downs, good years and bad. The differences are worth recording, but they were no more than minor variations in a consistent pattern in the established order of things in the Kolyma, which we shall be describing. Over the whole period, the ruling principle of Kolyma was that expressed in the brief and well-remembered address, which the post-war head of Dalstroy, General Derivenko, used to greet the newly arrived drafts as they fell in fives at Nagevo. Convicts. This is Kolyma. The law is the taiga, and the public prosecutor is the bear. Never expect to eat soup and bread together. What comes first, eat first. What's gone from your hands is lost forever. You are here to work, and to work hard. You must repay with your sweat and tears the crimes perpetrated against the Soviet state and the Soviet people. No tricks, no monkey business. We are fair with those who cooperate, pitiless with those who don't. We need metal, and you must produce this metal according to the plan. The fulfillment of the plan is our sacred duty. Those who do not fulfill the plan are saboteurs and traitors, and we show them no mercy. 31. Chapter 4: The Social Order of Kolyma. In Kolyma, a whole new social order in microcosm arose, with not only a formal and official structure, but also a network of economic and other relationships and customs, together with the growth of deep-set habits of mind appropriate to the society which gave them birth. This Kolyma social system reflected, in exaggerated form, the new nexus of privilege, power exploitation and subordination, which had come into being throughout the USSR. At the pinnacle of the Kolyma new class came, of course, the head of Dalstroy, a potentate whose word was law throughout the vast territories of the Northeast. We can easily set out the handful of other families who constituted the crime de la crime. They were those who had the privilege of shopping in the special store already, one of the perquisites of the Stalinist elite throughout the Soviet Union, which remains to this day one of the great economic benefits awarded to the privilegiansa. At Magadan this was *. The area was once visited, at a time in 1952, when a nuclear plant was planned to use the recently discovered uranium deposits by a man even more powerful than the head of Dalstroy. This was Beria's close associate General Goglitz, who terrified everybody, both official and prisoner. He was at this time head of the secret police for the whole of the Far East. His execution the following year was welcomed by all. Known as the Devyatka, or minor. Only 9 families held the special pass, which procured them, even in wartime, every luxury from oranges to chocolate to fine shoes and American cigarettes. These were I, the head of Dalstroy 2. His deputy, the head of Uzvidal 3. The head of the political administration 4. The head of procurement 5. The head of the NKVD troops in Kolyma 6. The head of the guard troops in Kolyma 7. The head of the regular troops in Kolyma 8. The head of the economic department 9. The head of the health department for Dalstroy 13. Below these, in an intricate pecking order, beset with endless petty struggles for advantage, came first their official subordinates, according to rank, then the free specialists, then the urkas, and finally the political prisoners. The successive heads of Dalstroy were, particularly in their position of comparative isolation from the rest of the USSR, men of power, responsible satraps of the most distant and detached province of the Stalin Empire. They normally ranked high. Nikishov was not merely a member of the Supreme Soviet, but actually a candidate member of the Central Committee itself, a colleague of Kosygin, Suslov and the others. It is true that they were subject to the usual precariousness of high position under despotism. But so were members of the Politburo itself. Meanwhile they enjoyed the fruits. Nikishov in 1942, at the age of 50, divorced his first wife and married a young communist of 29, named Gridasova, a primitive, crude, avaricious creature, Mrs. Upper tells us, who was only too well known to myself, and to other female prisoners, for she functioned as the harsh commander of the Magadan women's camp. Thanks to her husband's position, she rose in the military hierarchy and was decorated. She became the head of Maglag, the camp district of Magadan, and the surrounding region, and ruled the lives of tens of thousands of prisoners. The couple's country house, 45 miles northwest of Magadan, was furnished and equipped in the greatest comfort, and was surrounded by Nikishov's private hunting preserve. Nearby the prisoners of the invalid camp, called 72nd Kilometer, worked in a glass factory, which was under the special protection of Gridasova, and consequently always registered a marvelous production record. During the war burnt-out electric bulbs were repaired there, since new bulbs were almost unobtainable, and even tiny bulbs were sold at 150 rubles. 13. The Derivenkos, who succeeded the Nikishovs, also lived like princes. Derivenko organized his own theater, had his own court artists, wrestlers, clowns, and so on. When sea traffic opened, he would fly from Magadan to Vanino in his own plane, along with his artistic advisors, and select from the tens of thousands of unfortunates a handful of prisoners, considered good enough by Captain Zeiger, his first counselor, to join his personal theater company. Ostensibly this theatrical company was to distract his overworked mind from his heavy state responsibilities. For those few actors and artists, life was different from that of the other prisoners. They lived in town, had a few amenities, performed on the stage, and went around in two big American Diamond T trucks to play before camp inmates. Derivenko's prisoner troop toured the labor camps in the entire northeastern tip of Siberia, visiting each camp about once a month. This was no amateur group. It included numerous professionals, who had not only performed at the Bolshoi, but on the main stages of Europe. They traveled with reasonably good costumes and sets. Derivenko charged each prisoner 15 rubles admission per performance. Obviously none of the prisoners had that kind of money, but the regime provided an allowance for each prisoner, the allowance to be retained by camp authorities until the day of release, when regulations stipulated that the prisoner was to receive 300 rubles liberation money. The 15 rubles we paid for these shows were deducted from this special fund and pocketed by Derivenko. Derivenko and his advisors watched the arrival of our Oedip with keen interest. From it they selected some outstanding performers, a former dancer of the Tbilisi Opera, a violinist from Shanghai, an actress from Moscow, and another from Berlin, a famous trumpet player, Eddie Rosner, and his four-piece band. They were all given a bath, fresh clothes, and promptly sent by special plane to Magadan, where they were to start performing, for the enjoyment of Derivenko and his wife. Krivenko's wife, Galina Efimovna, had acquired the airs and graces of a person of stature, and not only wanted to be recognized as such, but to be unanimously accepted as the first lady of the region. She was a huge woman, weighing about 250 pounds, and resembled her husband in many ways. Though rude and arrogant, she still had her femininity. She liked to dress according to the latest Paris fashions, which meant that she kept the camp seamstresses and dressmakers working day and night par pour Leroy de Pros / A Romanian shoemaker once showed me the white brocade ball shoes he was making for her, carefully covering the delicate material with a white cloth so as not to get the slightest spot on it. 31 And so it was, in varying degrees of self-indulgence, in the lower leadership. Any lady who had the slightest connection with the camp administration would have her coats made free in the prisoners' tailor shops. For their private benefit, camp commanders freely made use of prisoners as cobblers, tailors, painters, artisans, fishermen, doctors, and so on, with the cooperation of prisoners in charge of food supplies and prisoners in charge of bookkeeping. All sorts of manipulations were carried on. The prisoners had every incentive to cooperate. It ensured their hold on the comfortable jobs, and they made a little profit besides. The mass of the prisoners in the camp suffered. 13 In the Berylyuk camp group, its chief, Colonel Vasiliev, exploited anyone who came within his range. Every day, a party of no less than 25 girls had to go to work at his house, milking the cows, feeding the hens, and polishing the furniture. Everything had to be done, of course, without pay. All services and supplies came to him, entirely free of charge. One day, he ordered the camp's carpentry shop to produce a complete classroom, left bracket for his son, right bracket, blackboards, desks and all. The cabinet makers were told to use the best materials and the best of workmanship. They did an excellent job, with some first-class carving, and they were very proud of their product. The problem now was the price. They knew full well what a stingy, miserable man Vasiliev was, but they had to account for the costly materials used. After much scratching of heads, they decided to quote him a price that barely covered the cost of the raw materials involved. They sent the bill to the camp's head office, where it eventually reached the colonel's desk. Next morning the rat burst into the workshop and began to curse the squad leader and his cabinet makers, calling them thieves and robbers. "Don't you believe in God?" he ranted. "How can you try to rob me? I am a poor working man, striving hard for my daily bread. How can you charge me 800 rubles? The frightened squad leader, anxious to soothe the colonel's anger, told him, "Citizen Colonel, there has been a gross mistake. That bill was not for you, but meant for someone else. Well, send your bill along tomorrow." The following day, Colonel Vasiliev found on his desk a new bill for only 300 rubles. It didn't cover a third of the cost of the raw materials, but he was quite satisfied because no one would accuse him of damaging the interests of the state. *1 A woman hospital chief, who owed her position to having married a prominent NKVD officer, is described by Mrs. Lipper. She had the manner of a lazy, well-fed cat. She never raised her somewhat nasal, eternally bored voice, not even when she sent an orderly to the gold mines for some minor offense. She came fully awake only when she talked about needlework, which she had her nurses make for her in large quantities. Patterns, yarn, color combinations were the things that passionately interested her. Nurses who did not know embroidery, no matter how conscientious they were about attending their patients, were treated by her with contemptuous tolerance. Those who could do needlework could neglect their patients as much as they wished and still be sure of the favor and protection of this so-called doctor. In the women's ward, there were always a few patients who looked and were remarkably healthy. These were kept busy embroidering tablecloths and tapestry hangings in the style of our grandmothers. All the ladies of Magadan society were wild about this hobby, and competed with one another, to the great joy of those prisoners who could do such work, for they could thereby earn additional food. It was amusing to see the wives of NKVD officers outbid one another in sending secret presents to the counter-revolutionaries. Officially such gifts were strictly forbidden, of course. But the ladies were so excited at the chance to enrich themselves cheaply, for in their eyes this superfluous and generally tasteless needlework represented wealth, that they forgot their ostentatious hatred and contempt for the kontriki. LZ Such a handful of stories, among dozens, was the life of the privileged caste. Even at a local level, Shalamov tells of the fortunes made by officials. Time and again, one is struck by the extraordinary gap between the ruling privilegedza and the prisoners. Even in Berzin's time, when the camp administration were pretty decent men, or at any rate, not vicious ones, one thing was characteristic of them all. They did not regard the prisoners, who were in their charge, and dependent on them as quite human, although some of them had been in the very same shoes in the past. Their attitude towards persons who had lost their freedom was very similar to that of the whites toward the Negroes in the United States during the period described in Uncle Tom's Cabin. This attitude had entered into the very blood of these men, for almost unlimited power over living beings deprived of nearly every right inevitably awakens the specific instincts of arbitrary tyranny, absolute intolerance of any opposition from these lower creatures, and complete irresponsibility in dealing with them. True, the illiterate fool Brukhnov was proud of having at his command, and working as common miners, 18 professors. But his pride grew out of his awareness that all these people, better and more intelligent and more honest than he, the flower of the nation, were in his hands, while he, a fool, who could not write his own name, could exercise his power over them, at will, in any form, and with total impunity. 23 Or again, we are told that Sukhanov, then head of the Northern Administration, had a servant, who had formerly been a professor of psychiatry. He treated him well, but with a certain contemptuousness, which even the best of free employees seemed unable to escape in their relations with prisoners. In the 1940s, this attitude was to be found everywhere. At 28, Nina Vladimirovna was the head of a hospital for 500 patients, which she always spoke of as my hospital. She behaved like a Pumshkitsa, a great lady and landowner of Tsarist times, and considered the entire staff of the hospital her personal serfs. She felt neither hatred nor contempt for the prisoners, no more than a landowner of earlier times would have hated his serfs. She looked upon them as tools supplied by nature to increase her wealth as the prerequisites for her position of power. But she was able to pity them. 13 In a further different context, we again find even women and doctors sharing the slave owner mentality, already noted at Vanino and Nakodka, at the Magadan transit camp in 1949. We were paraded naked, in front of a medical board of young girl interns just out from the Moscow University Medical School. Then we were carefully examined by broad-shouldered and friendly-looking civilians dressed in sheepskin coats and wearing high felt boots. These were the mine managers, the representatives of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the owner and sole supplier of detainee manpower. They pinched our muscles, opened our jaws, and felt our teeth. If satisfied, they addressed the board with the words, "I take him." There was seldom any protest from the medical beauties, who examined us with regard to the health of the men thus chosen. They merely nodded, and entry was ticked off, and the man's fate was sealed. He was headed for one of the mines, 31 at a lower level. The free specialists and others often lived more squalidly, while yet finding themselves in economic and other connection with the prisoners who lived incomparably more squalidly still. The atmosphere of social distinction was so pervasive that it affected even the very young. One Russian victim describes free children enjoying themselves by throwing stones at women prisoners. 34 In 1940, the hotel in Magadan was a large grey barrack containing middle officials waiting for their houses to be built, alcoholic mining clerks, pickpockets plying their trade between two sentences, and even a few forgers, who in spite of lack of tools, managed to make passable identity cards. In the hotel, where mining engineers, prostitutes, and the boss dollar of Kolyma got drunk on pure alcohol, fornicated, stole and cursed, for scrubbing the floors was nevertheless a joy and a privilege for the women prisoners, who even met kindness from some of the inhabitants, though also having to foil rape attempts and prostitution offers. There were other forms of connection between the lesser free population and the convicts. In the easier camps, the prisoners traded not only among themselves, but with the free citizenry also. In Kolyma, all goods were rationed because of transportation difficulties. The inhabitants had ration cards long before the war. Free citizens bought textiles and food at state prices and sold them at black market prices to the prisoners. These transactions had to be managed behind the backs of the guards, but there were always opportunities for at least a few prisoners, and they then passed on the goods to the less privileged prisoners, adding their own profit to the purchase price. In addition to genuine free citizens, there were freedmen, the handful of released prisoners, the lowest of the non-prisoner population. These two groups regarded themselves as of quite different social status, and rarely mingled. except, that is, that no stigma attached to former women prisoners. But most of the old free specialists were in any case rearrested in 1937 to 8 even, though some, especially geologists, were to be released in 1939. Prisoners who were released were, if under 50 and not declared invalids, forbidden to leave Kolyma. So were those over 50, if their skills were urgently needed in the region, that is everyone from engineers to cooks. After the war, there was a special regulation for